Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick.
I'm Tony.
And we're on a remote location for Cave of the Cross, episode 71. We're almost there. We're almost to the centennial. And, of course, if you're seeing this from the future, hopefully the Death Hornets have not taken us over. And whatever's next, for others for June, alien invasion.
Although, Patrick, I read today that they're edible. In fact, they're considered a delicacy in Japan.
Well, there's the end of world hunger. So if you're in the future, we good luck. Hopefully there's no trade-off there. But yes, if you're looking this in the future, the coronavirus has gotten to us, and Tony thinks I have cooties. So we're doing this from our respective bat caves. So that's where we're at. And so we're going over our book, Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey. The subtitle is 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. And if you've watched previous, we've gone through 3 of them. We're on our 4th principle. And we've had a nice little interview with Nancy Pearcey, who was gracious enough to come on and walk through.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, all 5 principles.
She was a nice lady. She answered all our crazy questions.
And she was glowing. She said, we're not like other podcasts. So I put that in our ad for her interview because that was pretty awesome. So yes, we do read the books, believe it or not. And so we're on principle 4, which is talking about kind of testing the worldview internally, but covering the basis for the first 3 before that. We had identify the idol. So anything that's not the Christian worldview, by its very nature, puts forth an argumentation up instead of God, and so it either puts man up or materialism, so that all things in the universe are only made of matter. That idea. So your worldview is kind of the lens with which you look at everything. So Nancy Pearcey draws principles from Romans 1, stating that anything that isn't God-centered in your initial outlook on how you view the world ultimately becomes an idol. Then principle 2 was how it reduces things. Most likely people is the reduction that occurs. Although we're going to get today about how even idol worship reduces the very concept of rationality and reason. And then principle 3 was looking at an external critique. Can it explain what we see about the world? And so that was right before Professor Pearcey's interview. So then we had the interview, and now we're on principle 4, which is it is called
It's the idol.
Yeah, it is test the idol. Does it contradict itself? And I always like this part because this is the area in which I think you ask the most questions towards the other side to figure out what it is that they're putting forth. And so you can do this with materialists, you can do this with postmodernists, you can do this with postmodernists, you can do this with any worldview. And that's the what she's laying out in this book is instead of having to learn about every single possible worldview idea out there, these are the principles in which we can test and check and see if it's explains things in the world, or if it explains away things in the world, which is what we saw in the last principle, or if it fails to meet its own standard, its own definition. So I think that's the fun part where we get into it here. So
we have two identifications and 2 tests so far.
Right, yeah, and they all do kind of blend together, and I guess you can transpose some of them around. This isn't a do A, B, C, but definitely identifying the idol will help you first. Seeing where the reduction is helpful, but I think you could probably switch around principles 3 and 4 here.
Yeah, I would think so too.
And this is intended for conversation purposes, and this isn't a checklist that you get through. This is supposed to be conversational based. So, all right. So why?
If you are using it for a checklist, don't say check. Right?
Yeah, check off. Yeah. All right. So why worldviews commit suicide? Ooh, that's a provocative title for principle 4 here. And so she starts off with what she's been doing, which is to tell a story of someone who is highlighting the principle that she's talking about. She's talking about this scientist who is a brain surgeon, and so he pretty much came to the realization that religion, especially Christianity, is congruent with science. So anything that science talks about is going to be right, and anything that religion talks about, that Christianity talks about, is pretty much just moral tales. It's not anything to kind of hang your hat on with what the universe is like, or kind of those bigger questions. So science is what's going to save us in the end. And so he says,
so this guy thought that, science was it, right? And Christianity was just a bunch of fairy tales to help us with our ethics.
Right.
And that live good and that sort of thing.
Right. So, yeah. So this is kind of Dawkins' kind of view of helps with survival, but Darwin and evolution is kind of what reigns supreme here. And so he does say Darwinian evolution, which seems to demonstrate that life could be explained perfectly well by material mechanisms alone. There was no need to invoke God. But when he went on to study things with the brain, he would try and kind of reverse engineer parts of the brain, and so he studied it. These what does he call them? Capillaries, which kind of act as vibration dampeners. And so what he used ultimately, instead of kind of his biology textbooks, were actually in engineering textbooks. Well, that seems odd, but okay, it's a mechanism. You can kind of think of the brain as kind of a computer without thinking that humans are computers. But he says, and what do engineers do? Well, of course, they design things. And so this got him to start thinking that, maybe it's not just random processes that speak for how life became to be and continues on. Maybe with engineering, it may point to design, or at least it operates. So this biological research operates on the presumption of design. For example, a standard procedure in biology is called reverse engineering, and then that's what he essentially tried to do to work out his brain surgery-ness.
By the way, we should say that the person she's referring to is Michael Ignor, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, who eventually became a professor and vice president of neurosurgery at State University of New York in Stony Brook.
Yeah, so a sharp guy.
Yeah.
Philosopher Michael Roos himself, and Darwinist, says biology unavoidably relies on design-type thinking. So if something doesn't work in nature, scientists and doctors and chemists are always saying, that's not how it should be, because there's this presumption of design, of order, of structure. So if you're testing a base and it reads as acidic, well, you go, the chemical process of the universe, because it's constantly in change, has all of a sudden, evolved, and now we have to rethink about the structure of the universe. They go, well, no, that's what it was like yesterday. That's what we should expect today. However, in a random chance universe with everything in constant flux, why have anything that's ordered or designed or expected? And so biology has this reliance on design type thinking. We treat organisms, the parts at least, as if they were manufactured, as if they were designed, and then try to work out their functions. The philosopher Roos writes, and directed thinking, teleological thinking, is appropriate in biology because, and only because, organisms seems as if they are manufactured and as if they have been created by an intelligence and put to work. And so in the book, she italicizes the as if. Those are big standout points of flashing warnings to hone in on. And so we saw in Principle 3, the phase as if signals cognitive dissonance. So that holding two thoughts at the same time that compete against each other. We saw this. 1984 kind of toys it with the doublethink terminology. And so, we're at war with Eurasia. We've always been at war with Eurasia, even though you might think that we weren't, but we are now. And so that's what you're forced to subscribe to, or your entire foundation collapses. And so that's what we want to hone in on. We want to collapse the foundation. So he goes on to Ignor's work. He goes on to say, I was surprised by how little Darwinian paradigm contributed to my work. By contrast, the design paradigm aligned nicely with the most important aspects of my research. When theory and facts contradict one another, which one would he follow? And so we saw this, and we'll see this throughout this chapter too, of Mitch Stokes' book that we went over, and how hard it is to give up a theory, even though we might see facts kind of go against it. And so all that can be searched for on our YouTube page as well for those short clips. He goes on to say that Darwinian process may explain some patterns in change in gene frequency in populations, of course, but the evidence does not even remotely support the claim that change and necessity fully accounts for the
chance, by the way.
Yes, chance and necessity fully account for the appearance of complex design in living things. And so we have people.
So notice what he's doing here is he's positing two potential explanations for what we're looking at here, right? One of them is it happened by chance. The other is it's just necessary. So, for instance, 2 plus 2 is just necessarily 4 because that's just the way things work. or the other explanation is by chance, right? It just happens, right? I flipped a coin, by chance heads came up. So those are two possible explanations for what we observe when we're considering, the universe, the earth, the things that we're trying to explain. Of course, the third one is, not chance or necessity, but it's design, right? It's the engineering of something to cause something kind of thing. And usually when we think of design, we think of a person. And so, so those are the three main areas with regard to ways to explain things. Yeah. Chance, necessity, or design.
Yeah. There was a video that I posted on our Facebook page for, let's see here, it was May 5th of 2020. It was a three-way interview with David Gletmer, David Berlinski, and Stephen C. Meyer. And their critique of kind of where science should be heading is an overthrow in this kind of Darwinian type thinking, and their conversation is very nuanced. And David Berlinski is a great crotchety old philosopher at this time, and I've always appreciated his openness and his candor with respect to calling out issues within the Darwinian theory. And so the other David has written a book review on Stephen C. Meyer's book, where he says, essentially that these unguided processes at the very beginning of to get us to where we're at are so. And he's a computer expert. He's a kind of not philosophy, but he doesn't just make computers. He's talking about theory of computer technology. He's saying, he's looking at his own work, that it's so infinitesimally impossible that it's almost like, you have your numerator one over whatever chance is. He says that denominator is so outrageously small to even get to, the next like nucleotide, let alone everything, and the pervasive of the Cambrian explosion is insane, and we should be reevaluating things just as we did with Marx and with Freud. And so it's a great little hour interview that I found, and I really enjoyed the talk that they had. Okay, so back to Ignor. He says, "For if there is no God, then no one is." He's saying that in fact, it is much more plausible that atheism, rather than Christianity, is this form of wish fulfillment that Freud warns us about. That religion is this wish fulfillment that can be turned against its own theory. However, it looks like atheism could also just have that same type of charge leveled against it. For there's no God, then no one is watching, then there's no moral accountability, and you can do whatever you want. And so he then
as long as you can get away with it,
right? As long as you don't get arrested, right? Yes. So he goes on to say then that now I see science as another way to appreciate the beauty of God's creation. I bring science into church with me. Truth is unitary, and so that's exactly what we're saying too. That our foundational belief, as Romans 1 tells us, that God exists and that He's the creator and He has certain qualities that are recognized by all creation, and from there we should have things like understanding that there's order in the universe, or we can even backwards walk it like the classical theorists do and say there's order, there's reason, there's intelligibility, there's moral standings, moral absolutes, and that should point to the existence of God. They're not competing with one another. Christianity, the Christian worldview, is saying that they run in parallel with each other because of, we would say reason is how God thinks, math is, how God operates in the world. The fact that there are miracles, the fact that we can see God enter into His creation isn't anything different than you or I entering new code into a computer program to get a different output than what would normally be expected.
So what she wants to do here is kind of hone in on this number 4 here, this principle number 4. And she talks, this next section is entitled Tests for Truth. And she says that Ignor's story illustrates the 2 major ways to test a philosophy or worldview, right?
Right.
So the first one is, does it fit the facts? And that's what we looked at in chapter 3, right? Does it fit the facts? Does the worldview, does the philosophy fit the facts, the world as it presents itself to us, right? And of course, it's pretty difficult to avoid that, right? In other words, if there's a wall there and I don't believe it's a wall there and I take off running, right? And I think I've given this illustration before, I'll hit the wall. So my theory that there's no wall there doesn't fit the facts. And in that instance, I pay for it, right? Right. So first, does it fit the facts? And secondly, is it logically consistent? Is it logically consistent? So she says these are the same questions raised, in testing any data, whether it's in a science lab, a court, asking a friend why, they're late. Does the explanation match what we know about the world, principle 3, and does the explanation hold together logically? She said these are the 2 ways that we test the philosophy.
Right. So speaking to that second point, and you're using your wall illustration, by saying there's no wall there and you point to it, you can kind of internally critique it and say, well, what are you pointing at if you don't, what are you referring to if you don't believe there's a wall there? You could say something like, I believe that wall is fake, or, there's a projection.
There's nothing there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But to say there's no wall there, that's where we can kind of start critiquing internally that person's point of view. First of all, okay, well, let's explain this wall thing first before you start getting running speed. And what are you referring to if it's that philosophy joke of the professor gives people at the end of the class to say, prove that this chair doesn't exist. And the one guy gets up after, 3 seconds, writes on a piece of paper, turns it in, and he writes down what chair, and he walks out,
Yeah. So does it fit the facts? Does the theory fit the facts? Does the worldview fit the facts? And is it logically consistent, right? She says internal contradictions are fatal to any worldview because contradictory statements are necessarily false, right? The circle of square is contradictory, so it's necessarily false, right? And scripture, she points out, assumes that logical contradictions cannot be true, right? No liars of the truth, 1 John 2:2. Mm-hmm. But God never lies, Titus 1:2, right? So, an especially damaging form of contradiction, she points out, is self-referential absurdity, which means a theory sets up a definition of truth that itself fails to meet. So here's the definition of truth. The theory says this is what truth is all about, but the theory doesn't meet that definition of truth. And so it refutes itself, basically, is what she's getting at here. And she points out a couple of illustrations here. She talks about, you probably heard the argument from self-referential absurdity, when relativists say something like there are no absolute, there are you ask them, is that absolutely true? Right? Or the skeptic who says, we can't know anything for sure. And of course, we would ask, do you know that for sure? Right? And so in each of these cases, the critic is turning the claim back on itself to show that it undercuts itself, that is, it is self-refuting, right? She points out that apologist Greg Koukl calls this saying that the philosophy commits suicide, right? In other words, he uses a graphic illustration. It kills itself, it slits its own throat, right? So, and she mentions that sometimes people, dismiss this as a rhetorical trick, but, again, it's not. It's a logical necessity, right? If it doesn't fit, right, then if it doesn't cohere, if all the statements of the theory, that sort of thing aren't, can't fit together without contradicting one another, that's a good indication that you have serious problems with the things that you're dealing with.
Right.
She says, in fact, we discovered that virtually all idol-based worldviews are self-refuting. Right? Why? Because they're reductionistic. And so, if you reduce particularly the human mind down to, let's say, physical processes only, then you leave out rationality and reason. And now, how can you reason about the mind if it's only a physical process and there is no reason, right? So so she's making this point that reductionist is the reason why worldviews have problems with regard to logical consistency. But of course, she raises the question: as soon as Christians raise the problem of contradictions, we likely get pushback from people claiming that Christianity itself contradicts, right? They point to the doctrine of the Trinity, right? Or Jesus' statements like, you must lose your life in order to save it. She says, but these are not genuine logical contradictions, right? In logic, the law of non-contradiction states that two antithetical propositions cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. And so, biblical theology does not say that God is one in the same sense that God is, three. So there's no contradiction, right? We have God as person and God as essence. They're two different senses of the words with regard to the numbers, is what she's suggesting. And of course, Jesus, she says, was using paradoxical language to make his point. More to the point, she says, Christianity is not self-referentially absurd because it's not reductionistic regarding human reason. It's not self-refuting. It doesn't commit suicide, right? So again, the problem with these worldviews, especially things like naturalism, is when reductionism is applied to the human mind, it reduces reason to something less than reason.
Right.
And says that our ideas in our mind are products of natural selection, Darwin, or in economic conditions, Marx's, or electrochemical responses of the brain, contemporary neuroscience. Yet the only way a worldview can build its own case is by using reason. And so she points out this inherent contradiction as a result of worldviews reductionism.
Right. Because if you're not using reason, you're not putting forth anything. And so there's no conversation by definition being had. If you're trying to say, well, that wall doesn't exist, you're using, even though it may be flawed, reason to try and convince me that exists. We're having a conversation and you're saying something like you can't trust your senses. So you're putting forth a argumentation. You're using reason. And I'll say, what are you referring to? Well, look at it. See right there. You can't trust your senses. Well, okay, but I'm looking at it. I'm using you're telling me to use my senses in order to look at it. So
or I'm listening, or so you're asking me or assuming that I'm listening to you. I'm using my senses.
There you go.
So
there you go. Yeah.
How can I trust what you're saying if I can't trust my senses?
all husbands know the take out the garbage line. I'm sorry, what? Yeah. And so she introduces the principle 4, test the idol. Does it contradict itself? By looking at an extreme form of empiricism within academia that had a huge overthrow, which was logical positivism. And so this
is huge, especially during the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I mean, just huge. Everybody kind of bought into this. And, this was the way to go. It's how really they justified Darwinianism. They justified leaving all kinds of metaphysical statements out of philosophy. I mean, this was huge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. William Lane Craig says this overthrow was the most important philosophical event of the 20th century. So pretty important. Logical positivists puts everything in a box of the senses. Any statement that cannot be traced back to the sense impression is rejected as false. So as Tony was saying, as these metaphysical claims, that they're hard, they're icky. We kind of want to do away with them. So let's say that it's not a sense impression. We can reject it. Good. Check. So logical positives took this claim a step further. It insisted that any statement not reducible to sense impressions is not just false, but cognitively misleading. That is not even subject to standards of true and false. So when we say
so it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything.
Right.
If you say God exists, well, God is non-physical, and therefore you can't sense God, and therefore the statement doesn't have any meaning.
Right.
That's what they were getting at.
Right. The character Cornswall feels feels soft. Or feels gobbledygook. That's exactly what it is. It is gobbledygook. It doesn't. It's not even true or false. It's you're using terminology that they can't even. I don't even understand what that means. Would probably come out of them. So
think of all the things that are non-physical, right? She gives some examples.
Yeah, slavery is unjust. Well, that I can feel that. I can test that. I know what justice feels like, and I can hold slavery in my other hand. And here, justice falls. I'm sorry, justice is heavier. So.
Clearly, justice can't be, felt, taste, touched, heard,
right,
or whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
So even having that conversation, yeah, even having that conversation, you can. It goes down to what she says here is that it reduces moral statements to expressions of emotions like boo, hooray, or icky. It's the icky feel. Well, slavery is just icky to me. Okay, but is it wrong? Well, I don't even know what you're talking about. So you can never have these moral claims in here because they're not sense impressions. This view of morality has percolated through all levels of society. After all, it's much easier to dismiss someone's views by saying that's just a value judgment and treating it as subjective preference instead of examining it seriously as a valid candidate for truth. Which is yes, you're right. It's definitely easier. You're just using Christianity just uses a subjective standard. You're just using a subjective God. That's not really what subjective means.
It's how you feel. Some of this came to be known as emotivism.
Right. Yeah.
I don't like or I don't feel good about murder. Not that it's right or wrong. It's just I don't feel good about it.
Which definitely hasn't carried over in today's school of thoughts at all. So that's good thing we got rid of that.
Right.
So what happened to logical positivism when applied to itself? Its central claim was the statements are meaningful only if they're empirically testable. Can you titrate it? Can you do a scratch test? Can you hit it with a hammer, see if it's malleable? Okay, so if the statement that anything is meaningful is only if the statement of logical positivism is only meaningful if it's empirically tested, is that true? Is that statement itself empirically testable? Well, of course not. It's not an empirical observation that empiricism is an entirely
statement, right?
Yeah, right. Entirely, yeah. It is a metaphysical rule, an arbitrary definition of what qualifies as knowledge. Thus, when the criterion of logical positive was applied to itself, it was discredited. It stood self-condemned. It hung itself. It slit its own throat. When applied to itself, logical positivists lost. And so this isn't a mere rhetorical trick. It's a powerful tool for testing truth claims. And that's true because, what they're applying to you as a universal statement should also be applicable to their own standard, because they're saying all of this is like this. Okay, is that also what you're saying? Can that meet the same standard? So I can universally say that there's absolutely no universal truth. Okay, well, is that statement a universal truth? No. Okay, well then you're wrong.
How can you say it?
Yeah, how can you say that? Or yes,
it's false.
Which then it collapses on itself, because you do have one. And so there are ways that she's going to get through to say that these angelic beings came and we can stand above and look down upon the peons and say, ha ha, look what I found. So we'll get into that a little bit later.
And really what she's trying to show here is that by pointing this self-referentially incoherent issue out is not just a rhetorical trick. It's an important philosophical way of evaluating statements and worldviews and theories.
Right. It's not arguing over definitions where you're like, you probably mean this word. And so you're like, haha, look, I've got you to reverse your position, because you're like, yeah, maybe I mean that word a little bit more than I mean this word. It's not something like that. It's to test itself, to put whatever they're saying should be the case under the weight of itself. Can it stand on its own grounds? Can it explain itself?
Next thing she wants us to know about is she labels this section hitting the marks. And she says the key to identifying whether a worldview commits suicide is to uncover its particular form of reductionism. So again, over and over again, throughout the book, she uses this concept of reductionism to help make her arguments, right? And to show the problem with these various worldviews and theories. She says any theory that says truth claims are nothing but X, so that is an important phrase, right? Truth claims are nothing but X is susceptible to self-refutation. So any theory that says truth claims are nothing but, and then they add something there, this is susceptible to self-refutation. So for instance, she says, Karl Marx said that truth claims are nothing but, you ready? Rationalizations of economic interests. That's all truth claims are.
Sounds like Marx. Yep.
Yeah. Laws are created by the rich to protect their property. Religion is the opiate of the people, placating the poor with false promises of a happy afterlife. Now notice, okay, Marx, what happens if we apply your rule to your own theory? So his rule says that truth claims are nothing but rationalizations of economic interest. Is that claim nothing but a rationalization of economic interest? Right? If it is, if you're kicking the rest of them out, then you should kick your own out too, right? So did he create it merely to rationalize his own economic interests, he asked? She asked us. If so, we can dismiss it as a serious truth claim, because he says, those type of economic rationalizations of interests don't work. And so if all truth claims are like that, his must be like that too. And if none of the truth claims that are like that work, then his doesn't work either.
Right.
It's the issue that she's trying to point out. Nietzsche, she says, held that, notice, all human action is, here it is, driven by the will to power. Yeah. Right? All human action is driven by the will to power.
Very standard Nietzsche summation. Yeah.
That's right. Morality is invented by the weak to give them leverage over the strong. It's kind of interesting here. Religion and morality are getting picked on, right? Marx said it's the opiate of the people. It's to keep people in their place, right? The strong over the weak. Nietzsche says morality is invented by the weak to give them leverage over the strong. So kind of just the opposite of what Marx was. Religion, he says, is a holy lie used to control people. But what about Nietzsche's own theory? Was it driven by his own will to power? So if a theory that's driven by will to power is wrong, is Nietzsche's theory driven by will to power?
Right.
Right. And if that's the case, then why should the rest of us pay any attention to it? Right. So all human action is driven by the will to power. All right, fine. What about your human action with regard to your theory? Is it driven by will to power? If it is, then we can dismiss it and not pay any attention to it, just like you, Nietzsche, want to do with the rest of the theories that you evaluate.
Yeah, he just
wants Sigmund Freud.
Power over us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sigmund Freud insisted that our thoughts are shaped by unconscious emotional needs. Personality is shaped by things like early toilet training. Much of human behavior is a result of sexual repression. But what does that imply about the origin of Freud's own theory, right? If our thoughts are shaped by unconscious emotional needs, is your thoughts, Freud, shaped the same way?
Yeah.
And if so, if you're criticizing the rest of the thoughts, then yours falls into that same criticism.
Yeah, including the thought that thoughts are shaped by unconscious emotional needs.
Right. Yeah. Lastly, she talks about B.F. Skinner. Right, this is our behaviorist. Right, he's the king of behavioralism. Behavioralism was really big in the mid portion of the 20th century. B.F. Skinner held that humans are nothing but stimulus response mechanisms responding to rewards and punishment. Right, stimulus response. You've heard of the experiment about Pavlov's dog.
Yeah.
Right,
that drooling dog.
That's right. Ringing bells and drooling, right? And so that's a behavioralist type of experiment. So humans are nothing but stimulus response mechanisms responding to rewards and punishment. The behavior is explainable in terms of operant conditioning, like the pigeons in his experiment pecking at levers to get a pellet of food. But the question we can turn back to Skinner, right? Is Skinner's theory a product of his own conditioning? If it is, and he's saying that theories that are a product of self-conditioning are wrong, his would have to be wrong as well. And so it's self-refuting, right? And so she points out that what these philosophers all share is a refusal to take truth claims at face value. Instead, they interpret them as cover-ups for hidden motives and disguised self-interest, right? And so what she wants us to understand here is, as a tool of critiquing thinking, she says a hermeneutic of suspicion can be useful, right? In other words, we want to say, okay, what are they really saying? How does that apply to itself? We want to be suspicious of what they're saying. So a hermeneutic of suspicion can be useful to highlight common human failings, to diagnose the ways of our thinking may be distorted by things like economic interest or psychological impulses. Scripture teaches, she mentions here, that we deceive ourselves all the time about our true motives. The heart is deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? Jeremiah 17. So taken on its own terms, however, hermeneutic of suspicion is radically reductionistic. It simply abandons the question of truth, reducing it to questions of power and desire. So these folks, not us, as I mentioned, that was not correct, but these folks had a hermeneutic of suspicion. They were suspicious of all truth claims, and so they applied that suspicion to all truth claims, but they failed to apply it to their own truth claims. As a result, when it is applied to their truth claims fall apart as well. Yeah, if indeed what they say is true.
Yeah, I always think of Michael Shermer from Skeptics Magazine. How he's Mr. Skeptic. He's skeptical of all these things. Well, except what's mainstream science and what the experts are telling him, and there's never a time where it's like, okay, let's be skeptical and turn this on its own head. Let's start questioning Bigfoot and those who respond to Bigfoot or Darwinism or whatever it might be. It doesn't seem like when you're skeptical, you're not quite skeptical enough, as the tagline for Mitch Stokes' books would say.
That's right.
Yeah. So we're trying to debunk the debunkers. Romans 1 approach explains why the argument works, because idol-based worldviews are reductionist. By defining defying something lower than the biblical God, they also recast humans in the image of something lower, because we're made in the image of God. By reducing God, they reduce humans as well. The process of reductionism includes human cognitive faculties like reason, logic, rationality. It reduces human rationality to some non-rational force or process. Yet once you make a theory that claims that our ideas are not the product of rational thought, that claim must be applied to all ideas, including the theory itself, and that's really, really important to understand. So if you're making a rational truth claim, then you have to apply that to the theory itself.
Good. Yeah.
So,
and when we do, what she finds here is that they're self-refuting.
Right. So that's what they should be doing to even their own theories, and that they would do if they were being consistent. Except they exempt themselves from their critique all the time because they don't want to be discredited. They act.
Yeah. So that's the issue here, right?
Right.
So they only apply this to other people's theories. And they exempt themselves as if they have a God's, eye view of what's really going
Right.
on, and they're the only ones that know, right? And so they exempt themselves. No, you can't do that. You have to, put your theory on the block as well and examine it to make sure that it can, meet your objections.
Right. So this is pretty much elitism through and through. People like Marx who want to talk about this class conflict. Well, he himself is not subject to class conflict, right? Because he's not trying to control the masses through economic means. Of course not. He's trying to rise up everyone against that to lead into a socialist nation and then ultimately to a utopian of communism. So he's able to mysteriously rise above forces that enslave everyone else. They alone are capable of achieving the untainted insight into reality. So this godlike perspective, which you're looking down upon creation, and you're like, yes, here's where the sin of economics has led humans astray, and I know this, and I will reveal this through communicative needs in a book and inspire other people to follow after me. Boy, I wonder what that sounds like. But of course, by carving out an exception for themselves, they have introduced a logical inconsistency in their system. They have stated that there is one thing, namely their own thinking, that their system does not cover. And so this is they don't see the exception to the rule in math, science, logic. So this isn't true scientific. And if there's one, well, why not more? And
why does their theory is the only one?
Right? Yeah,
there can only be one, and it's mine.
Yeah. By contrast, the Christian worldview is not reductionist. It does not reduce reason to something less than reason. Therefore, it does not self-destruct. Christian epistemology, the theory of knowledge, starts with the transcendent Creator who spoke the entire universe into being with His Word, and this word is also reason and rationality. The underlying principles that unifies the world into an orderly cosmos as opposed to randomness and chaos. So God created with order. How did He do so? By reason, logic, mathematics. This is how He sustains the world. It's how He thinks. And so when we put everything in the right order, everything glorifies Him as pointing to Him, as Paul says in Romans 1. And we're able to kind of stay on the train track. The train track isn't this depressing rules-based system, but it's why you don't lick doorposts, because by licking doorposts you get sick, and so it's not a terrible thing to tell people not to lick doorknobs. So.
By the way, what would happen to the train if it got off the train track?
Right, so it wouldn't. It either wouldn't move or it would destroy itself because it's it's barreling down.
Yeah.
And so that's also a good point because people are still moving. They're still utilizing this cognitive distance, and they're still coming up with conclusions. And what do they have to do in order to continue to figure out things? Well, it's to assume order. It's going back to what we first started. It's to assume not this biology is randomness, but that there's a structure, that there's an engineering based system to that, and we definitely see that within our discoveries of DNA and how it's not just a placeholder for whatever biological need. It's actually information. It's pretty amazing of the discoveries that DNA has shown, that structure and order and information, which information is a communicative tool, and the DNA seems to be this only time where information isn't it doesn't originate from anything that's an intelligence. So,
in other words, they give it an exception.
Right. Yeah. Right. So they've reduced DNA to what it only appears like.
So all information comes from intelligence except DNA. Right. The structure of DNA. No, that couldn't be.
Right. So the biblical view has two crucial implications. First, the intelligible order of the universe reflects the mind of the Creator, and second, because God created humans in His image, our minds correspond with that order as well. There is congruence between the structure of the world and the structure of human cognition. How do we know things? Because God has made us such that we can be like Him in this certain way, and we can know things about the world in which we also operate ourselves in. So God has created both us and the world in such a way that there's a certain fit or match between the world and our cognitive faculties. The fall, though, has darkened or distorted this. However, we still retain the image of God. And so throughout history, the Bible has inspired confidence in the essential reliability of human cognitive faculties. So, why do we have wrong theories and ideas? Because this distortion of truth because of the fall. But we're still able to know things because we're not completely depraved in our own in being reflective of the Creator. Biblical epistemology is backed up experientially by general revelation. To function from day to day, humans have to assume that we do have a great many things that the material world.
So notice she says here, in order to function,
right?
In order to exist in the world,
to continue
we have to
on.
make some exception, right? Some assumptions here, right?
Yeah. The material world is
and
real.
She gives us a list of about 6 or 7 assumptions that we have to make in order to function in the world.
Right. So the material world is real. The chair I'm sitting in on will hold me up, or that there's even a chair. That the universe works by cause and effect. If I drop this book, then it'll fall. That our memories are basically reliable. What did I eat for lunch today? I know. Nothing. That other people have minds, even though I cannot directly see them. And that laws of logic are valid. To discredit logic, I have to argue using logic. In our daily actions, we have to assume the basic reliability of human cognition. And all these are metaphysical claims. And what
the logical positives would say doesn't exist or is new.
Right. But then you have people like Mises, Ludwig von Mises, who had this praxeology, the study of human action, that humans do act, and there's kind of that determination from a donkey of he's 50 feet away from 2 barrels of water, and so which one does he do? Well, he's equal distance away, and so he can't choose, right? There's no way for the donkey to move, and so he's just unable to move, and so he dies of thirst. Well, no,
or the monkey who puts his hand in the thing and grabs, I don't know what he grabs, nuts, I guess, and he has them in his fist, but now he can't get his hand back out of it. And so he doesn't want to let him go because he wants the nuts, but he can't get his hand out because his fists, is clogging up the way to get him out. And so he has a serious problem.
Right. So we have to function as if humans have all these things in order to go. I don't believe that there's any other minds, that I existed 5 minutes before we just started this podcast. I'm going to write a book about this. To who? Who am I writing this book to? Nobody, right? And I'm not even sure once I finished that book that it wasn't 5 minutes that I just came about this solipsism issue. No, you don't argue that way. You don't function that way. But they always, the reductionists always want to carve out these different facts for themselves. So anything we must assume in order to function in the world is part of general revelation, which we all have access to. It's not just, only believers only Christians can operate morally. No, there's general revelation which points you to a biblical Christian God, because you can say, this is wrong or this is right, or I have an icky feeling towards this, and that's wrong to have that icky feeling. You don't want icky feelings, right? So there's that. So all these signposts point to the biblical God. The upshot is that all worldviews have to borrow the Christian epistemology, Christian worldview, in order that, at least at the moment they are making their claims, they must tacitly assume the reliability of reason and rationality, which only a biblical worldview supports. They have to function as if Christianity is true, even as they reject it. And I think she goes into this great point of C.S. Lewis, who I think puts a huge tack in making this point.
Makes a point. In fact, that's what's coming next. C.S. Lewis's Unmasked Materialism. I think we've been going on a little while here.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have a break here and pick this up next time and continue.
Right. So as far as this goes, this is episode 71. Next one will be 72, and we'll hopefully have a few more things here and there in between. Just to point you at a few places, go to Cave of the Cross, apologetics.com. There's all our links for how to find our different social medias, Facebook and Twitter. I've been posting daily deals for good Kindle book deals, with the caveat that not everything there is, of course, a recommendation, but man, you get some really good deals from us. So, and it helps support the show. And also, we're on Patreon.
They'll at least make you think. These books will at least make you think.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm not just putting forth ones that I think fit to my worldview too. There are evolutionary Christians in there too that write really good books that I think that you have to contend with, that make really good points and make you think. But it's definitely I try and at least there's not going to be a Joyce Meyer's book in there or anything like that.
Sorry, Joyce.
Yeah, I'm not. I've had to read a book for Lauren for our Patreon. So we're also on Patreon. If you want to go there, patreon.com/Cave of the Cross, and there we have the 3 tiers for how to support us if you want and get extra content. But her and I read a Joyce Meyer's book that. Man, that was draining. Whew, man, that was rough. So if you want to see me suffer, that video will be posted in our 3rd tier. So that's all I can think of. caveofthecross.com/EP71. If you ever want to go back to our previous ones, like our interview with Professor Pearcey, that's episode 69. So caveofthecross.com/EP69. Whatever number of episode we're on, that's where you can find the video, the audio, the links to books, anything like that. So, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being with us during the cootie times, the time of darkness, and we'll probably be back doing the same thing again. So, thank you.
See you next time.